I'd like to welcome you to our 13th program of the Speakers Programs program for the quarter. And we have with us the publisher of the Los Angeles Times, Mr. Otis Chandler. And he will talk for a little while, 10 or 15 minutes, and then we would like to, as we usually do, open it up for questions and answers. And if you'll just stand up, we'll repeat the questions. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Mr. Otis Chandler.
Thank you, Bob. Obviously, most of you came just to see what a publisher looks like. We are human, and we do move around a bit, but not enough. I see following Muhammad Ali yesterday. I would have liked to have heard him. Sure, if I were your age, I wouldn't take my time in a pretty day like this on your nice campus to come and listen to a newspaper publisher. So I do appreciate those of you that have come. Just want to say a few words about some rather important issues regarding the press, and whether you think the press is important or not in your own lives. It is terribly important in this country because most of the people in the country depend upon the press for their information upon which they base their decisions. And the things that are not going well in the country, as you know, many people tend to blame the press for. I really think most people in the country are not very happy with what's going on, in spite of occasional good news. I looked at our paper this morning and looked at the front page, and we had only one story which could give one any hope at all, and that was the story on the SALT talks. Other stories were on the Russian Jews being sentenced and on the Sadat turning down Israeli conditions for the opening of the canal, the postal increase, sonic booms destroying our parks, and so on. So I think generally things are about as bad as they have been. I don't think things are getting much better, in my opinion. I think a lot of people are really very concerned about their media, their newspapers and their books and their radio and television stations. I think their concerns are really several concerns. A lot of them are concerned about the credibility of their media. Can you believe what you read? Can you believe what you see on television? Can you believe what you hear on radio? What about our magazines? What about our books? So on. I think some are also concerned, and I think probably you are not as aware as you might be of the concentration in this country of media. It's really concentrated in very few hands. There's about a dozen companies in this country that own the majority of the media. I'm not talking about just newspapers, I'm talking about radio and television, magazines, newspapers, just a dozen. So those people that run those companies are really, in effect, responsible for giving you whatever information you desire that's important in your lives. I think other people are concerned about the content of the media. One of the most critical things I have about the Times, and I'm also involved in a major paper in Texas and a major paper in the state of New York, is that they feel that we're only giving them bad news, that we seem to relish in our words and our pictures and our sounds. We're also in the television business in our company, about violence and about hatred and about death and destruction and crime and so on. Most of our readers, who tend to be older readers, our average reader of the Times is about 39 to 40 years of age. They are very unhappy with the kind of news that we are giving them. They really want and prefer good news. They say, why don't you ever give us, instead of the kind of news we get on the front page, why don't you give us some news about what the majority of the students are doing, what the majority of the blacks are doing, what the majority of the Chicanos are doing, about the good cop, about the working mother, the 90% of the Americans who are straight, who are law-abiding and tax-paying and hard-working citizens. Some even say to me, give us only good news. This is an interesting phenomenon that's occurring recently. They say, for example, that only about 10% of the population tends to be in the news. And why don't you talk about the 90%, as I say, that are going about their daily lives, getting their education, raising children, paying their taxes, and so on. We try to do some of that. We try to make news, create news about positive aspects of our life. We try to make news out of motherhood and church and so on, and we do have a large staff that develops these stories, and yet very few people read them. It's very discouraging to us, but we do try to respond to this criticism. Most readers really go right by these stories and go right to the stories about bombings and the war and Manson, anti-war marches and so on, earthquakes, whatever is hot, whatever is really the news. I think that either man's innate curiosity is more toward kind of this news, or we become so accustomed to reading about man's inhumanity to man that we really feel obligated each day to check the latest box scores. One television station I noticed recently in Roanoke, Virginia, conducted an experiment on this good news versus bad news business, and they ran a half an hour each night of just good news. It was at first well received, and then after a while nobody watched it, which I think is understandable. I think people get a little bored with stories that just deal with the average. After all, news is the unusual. I think our basic job is really to report the news and to suggest significance, to set down in some detail the essential facts of a story, and then to explain the relationships between the hard facts of that story. Much of the news today is really dark, and it's sad and hideous and almost overpowering. But this bad news won't go away. It's merely a reflection of the times, I think, in which we live. We can't hide it as a newspaper. We can't lie about it. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. Our responsibility really is to tell it like it is. If we didn't, I don't think we deserve to exist. And more importantly, if these problems were not laid out, you wouldn't know about them. Maybe that's a good thing, but in the end, I think that we couldn't exist in this country without a press. The press, a lot of people think, caused the problems. This is Agnew and Reagan and Yorty and Chief Davis and Sheriff Pitchess. They tend to feel that we are the cause of many of their problems. And I really don't agree with that. I can't agree with that. The press didn't start the war in Vietnam. It didn't create slavery. It didn't cause the invasion of Cambodia or the incursion into Laos. We didn't cause Kent State or inflation or most of the major problems that exist today. We really just report, and how well we do this is subject to legitimate criticism. I think the media in this country does have enormous influence and power, call it power if you want, but really only to a point. We're not indispensable, and none of us in the media think that we're indispensable. Mankind could survive without us, and very easily. It did for centuries. Only in the last 6 lifetimes, out of a total of 800 lifetimes, if you break down man's existence in the last 50,000 years, there's been 800 lifetimes, Alvin Toffler's book, and only in the last 6 lifetimes have we had a printed word. So the press is a relatively recent arrival. And only in this present lifetime, which is the 800th, has the electronic media arrived on the scene, radio and television. More and more people, I think, are upset with the pornography and the nudity and the hard language which they find in the press. It's a problem for us as a newspaper as to how much of it should we put in the Times. These same people that don't want this kind of news or this kind of lifestyle reported, they are the first to cry censorship, of course, if we leave anything out that they're personally interested in. Younger readers, on the other hand, criticize us for really being too square, too establishment, and maybe we are. They think we should publish the language as it's now being used. But on the other hand, if we did, I don't know if we would continue to exist as a newspaper, because of our million circulation, most of that is older readers who would not, I think, want to read our paper if we did start printing the language. There's also a move afoot that is, I think, the most dangerous of all, and that is the move toward government regulation. Probably something you're not familiar with at all. The government would like to set up a press council which would, in effect, grade our performance each day against norms that the government would set up. There are several bills in the Congress to do this. Now, this would be challenged under the First Amendment, but can you imagine President Nixon appointing a press council of his friends and people that he owes favors to, and having them sit in judgment on the CBS and NBC and ABC and the Los Angeles Times or the New York Times, and have them look and read and listen to the major media and then give us a report card every day? But this is seriously being suggested. Other ideas on this whole area of regulation include the licensing of newsmen, like a doctor or a lawyer. Since we call ourselves professionals, certain people in Congress say, all right, then you should be licensed. Then there's the idea of extending to newspapers the equal time requirements of broadcasters. So if we write a story about a SDS meeting, and we should also allow in our newspaper the right wing to respond in equal space. Also, another idea proposed that editorial writers should not remain anonymous, that they should sign their editorials every day. Another idea that there's sentiment in some parts of the country for a law that all newspapers should be required to have an ombudsman sitting at the publisher's desk, that the public should be represented through an ombudsman. People should be intently involved with the sources and the quality of the information that you receive. The press should be subject to careful and painstaking scrutiny at all times. But I think government criticism is one thing, but government interference and government regulation and government control is quite a different thing. I don't think we really can exist as a free press if you have government regulation or control or intimidation. Most politicians, most people in public office at every level, local, state, and federal, really dislike us. It's a strong word, but they really do. They wish we would go away. We really bother them, we annoy them, and we certainly tax their patience. They ask why we cannot go along with them without really challenging them on every issue. Many of them really do not understand the function of a press. They feel they were elected by the people and or appointed by officials who were elected by the people, so why can't the press trust them? They say the people do, they elected us, so why can't you fellows in the press just agree with what we're doing and let it go at that? But I think it is our role to be a watchdog and to tell the people as much as we can possibly find out about their police chief and their sheriff or their city council or their governor or the FBI or the president. We are a separate and independent force with considerable power to influence public opinion. To localize this point for purposes of illustration, let me give you a few examples. We continue to feel very strongly, as many of you may know, about the needs of the city of Los Angeles and the need for improvement, and that our mayor really is not attentive. He's not only not here, but when he's here, he's not attentive to the problems of the city of Los Angeles, and we feel very strongly, and we will continue to speak out, even though he brings pressure to bear on me personally and on the Times and on our advertisers and so on to try to get us to cave in. We also feel that local law enforcement is in error in certain specific instances. And even though we know this is unpopular to be against law enforcement, we will continue to speak out when we disagree with our police chief or we disagree with our sheriff, and we have in recent months. The Ruben Salazar case was a good example, or the killing by the police chief of the Mexican Americans recently is another example. Although it upsets Reagan for us to speak out about maintenance of the maintenance of the present quality of higher education, we will continue to speak out. Nixon is very unhappy with us about our attitude on the war. We want to get out of the war. We want to get out now, and he's very unhappy with us about that. And it even affects our ability to cover the news in some respects. The doors that were open, the people that would talk to us previously are now silent or are unavailable. The Times is the largest single voice in this community. This community is the largest in the state, and the state is the largest state in the nation. So with over 1 million daily circulation, which really translates into something like 3 million daily readers, we really have a deep sense of obligation and responsibility to the community, as well as our readers, to tell the truth each day. We tell it as best we can with a staff of some 500 full-time journalists. We go into great detail, as you know, in trying to report the truth. I think this is the responsibility of a free press under the Constitution, and I think that it's terribly important to maintain this and to not be influenced by the attacks by the government. I don't think I've ever seen such direct attacks by the government at all levels to try to intimidate the press, to try to get us to shut up and to not speak out and to not investigate and to not report and to really challenge our credibility. The Nixon administration feels their credibility is being challenged, and so rather than try to correct that impression, they are trying to, primarily at television and CBS, they're trying to negate the credibility of the press in an attempt to build up their own credibility. And I think this is a dangerous and a very short-sighted ploy. Those are just a few thoughts I had, and wanted to give them to you, and then if any of you have any questions on this or any other subject involving the press or whatever, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes? Well, there's a Senator McIntyre, I think he's from New Hampshire, if I'm not mistaken, has introduced a bill. There have been several bills over the past couple of years introduced. There's been a lot of discussion in governmental circles about it. The bills haven't gone very far, but the fact that they're even introduced to me is significant, because what it could mean someday if they became law would mean that we would be like Pravda and Izvestia, and the government would completely have us regulated, not only content but our ability to exist, and you wouldn't know what's going on. We would be a government-controlled press and just an extension of the government. Yeah.
You mentioned that a lot of people complain about the fact that news that gets on the front page tends to be on the unpleasant nature. Now, I for one feel that sometimes news, let's say, on the cultural field, why does that always have to be reported, in the fourth section? Like, I know a few weeks ago, Darius Milhaud gave a farewell concert at UCLA. Now, I thought that this was fairly major news. I mean, here was a man, leading composer, who lived in California for 31 years and returning back to France. Now, why it had to be buried practically in the art section seemed beyond me. That should have been given front page coverage. And I think there are other examples of this, news of artists, musicians, things that really count. People will remember Darius Milhaud 500 years from now, and whereas something which really unpleasant, but over the long run will be ephemeral.
Philosophically, I think you have a point, but pragmatically, we have to be responsive to our 3 million daily readers, and I would think if I did a market research study among our readers, I don't think they would really want that on the front page. It may be terribly significant in its own right, but most of the readers of the community who read our paper would not think that should be on the front page. I get the same reaction from people who are interested in a financial story or a sports story or a political story. It's a matter of news judgment on our part. The staff I have are professional newsmen who have been in the business a long time, who I think do reflect the needs and interests of the community, and it's their judgment as to what goes on the front page. And I think if we were to put that kind of a story on the front page, I would suspect we would have a tremendous outpouring of phone calls and letters and questions. What are you doing with this paper? Why was the SST vote or Lockheed's problems or the SALT talks or something else put in back? I mean, you only have one front page, and it only takes about 6 stories any one day can go on the front page. So yeah, but something has to be substituted. You're saying put that story in the front page. Well, then we have to take off of the front page some story to make room for it, right?
Yeah, but I have seen a number of stories which haven't been on the front page, frankly. I think fairly objectively speaking, if it was on the second page, it would have been all right.
Okay. Somebody down here had a question. Front row, yes?
I got the feeling during the last election, that the Times felt that the race for governor of the state of California and the race for U.S. Senate was important, and there was considerable coverage of that. It was much harder to find anything about the Congress, the House of Representatives, along even to the same degree. In other words, you had a little perfunctory column called Know Your Congressman, which would usually appear way back in the back of the place. And we could, I just looked day after day and could never find any kind of personalized stories about these races. And some of these issues are very polarized over the war and over the, for example, supersonic transport and various other kinds of very important issues facing this country. But it seemed like your paper was kind of indifferent to the situation. When you have that, then what happens is that the incumbent, just by the fact of his franking privileges and often his moneyed support, winds up with a clear advantage, and the press has advocated its responsibility to the putting forth of other issues by other than the incumbent.
Well, I think you have a point. I wish we could, of course, have more space for much news that is not given its proper importance in the paper, but it's a matter of a newspaper is a business, and you have to allocate space according to certain economic factors. And in the congressional races, we cover a very broad area. We're not just Los Angeles County, but we cover primarily the 5-county area. And if you add up the number of congressmen who are running for re-election in those counties, I think we couldn't do just a job on one county or one congressman. We would have to try to cover all of them in some detail. We did run those personality or profile sketches, but we did have several times during the campaign by our political staff long takeout stories on some of the congressmen. I think most of the congressmen do feel neglected, and a lot of other people feel neglected by the lack of coverage in their local paper, but it's a matter of allocation of space. We wish there were an answer to it, but we can't print all of the news. No paper can. So it's a matter of balancing.
Yeah, I would just say, I'm just urging that the amount of space given to the congressional campaign be, say, approximate to that of the Senate and approximate to that of the governorship. And that's what I find.
I don't think you will find that, because I think more people are interested in the major races rather than just in the congressional race for their area, because you're really just taking a very small segment of the readership and saying, we're talking about your congressman now. Well, the rest of the readers don't even know the name of the congressman. So it's a problem. Yes?
Government, on top of everything else, is changing the English language and terminology that we have been using. And I wonder why the media have gone along with the government and used protective reaction and incursion instead of saying there's been an invasion of Laos, instead of incursion of Laos, and why we're not bombing cities, we're only having protective reaction strikes. I think this is very bad. I think the media is going along with the government, and I don't think they should.
Well, I would like to differ with you on the fact that we are ourselves using these words. We are only reporting what the President or the Vice President or Secretary Laird or Westmoreland or whoever it might be. They are the ones that are using this language. We are not using them ourselves. When we do an editorial, when one of our columnists writes about these subjects, we do not use this language. We use exactly the language that you would prefer that we use. It's only in the news reports, and I don't think it would be right for us to report a speech by Laird or a speech by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and change his language. Well, I'm not here to defend television. I'm sure this is done occasionally, but I know in our paper we do not use those words ourselves. That's not in our vocabulary. Yes? Sure it does. And for a very good reason, that if we didn't have all of that advertising, we wouldn't be able to bring you over 300 columns of news a day, which is larger than any paper in the world. The only way we support the staff of 500 and have 20 bureaus around the world and have the kind of, I think, in-depth reporting we do is because of advertising. We lose money on circulation. Circulation does not even pay for the white space, let alone for the editorial staff. So you have to have a large volume of advertising. But if you take away the advertising, there's over 300 columns average a day not Sunday, but just a day of hard news. So it's the economic fact of life that to perform the service we do, we have to exist as an economic entity, and to do that, we have to have advertising.
So I wasn't questioning advertising as opposed to not having advertising.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed a little extreme because it
No.
seems like the first section, you put the total news on 4 pages.
Well, we run the same ratio of advertising to news that most of the major papers do, although we have more advertising than any other paper in the world, and I'm glad we do, because we couldn't, as I say, perform our news function if we didn't. Yes?
Out of these 500 journalists that you have, how many of them are women?
Well, I couldn't give you a head count. I would estimate somewhere in the neighborhood of 10%.
And how many of these 10% work exclusively on the 4th section, women's section?
Probably most of them.
I object to that type of text.
I do too, but I wish we could find women who are capable of covering the news. No, it really isn't, young lady. If you could see the number of applicants that we have, which are very few, and then see their experience pattern and their educational background, we would love to have more women. We even go around the campuses and recruit women, and we recruit women off of other newspapers and Time magazine and so on. We can't find the number of women we want.
What are your qualifications? Master's in journalism?
Usually, right?
And then work in small newspapers?
No, usually a master's in journalism. And there are very few women that have masters of journalism who want to work the hours, and we have a little girl named Linda Matthews, for example, that she's now getting a law degree at Yale. Maybe she's already received it. And she was covering the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and she was picked up. She was going back to phone in her story, and she was picked up by the police and beaten and thrown in jail. And now she's the kind of hardy soul that could put up with that, and it didn't upset her. But most gals who come in would not want to be subject to that kind of a treatment, and this is the nature of our business today. We have to assign hard hats to our reporters when they go onto a campus that's on fire, or when they go into an area that's exploding, let alone the war zone. Women are not willing to make that commitment in terms of their own safety. So I wish, if you have any friends, send them in the back of the room.
I'd like to ask you something about Earl Caldwell's case. That's the New York Times report.
Yeah.
Two things. First of all, if the government is successful in making him testify, will that seriously harm any of your newspaper sources? And secondly, if the government is successful with Earl Caldwell, do you think that they could also be successful in curtailing editorial policies and positions which the government doesn't like by use of the courts rather than through legislation?
The answer to your question is yes, in both instances. The Caldwell case is a very significant case. I don't know if, I can't recall whether we're amicus on that or not, but I think we are. We were at the lower court. I doubt that the government will prevail in that. If they do, it's a very serious thing. We have been involved in our own right here in 2 cases along the same lines, where we have a photographer in Orange County who was covering a student disturbance at Cal State Fullerton, and I guess it was the county sheriff subpoenaed our photographer's unused or unpublished negatives to try to prove or make a case against certain students, and we fought that up through the Court of Appeals and we won it. Very similar to the Caldwell. It's similar to the present problem that CBS is having with selling of a president, although that's a House subcommittee that's trying to subpoena the unpublished or screen portion of the selling of the president. If the government were to prevail in the courts in this whole area, it would definitely mean a major step toward the elimination of a free press, because we would then feel, our reporters would feel, that they could not go to sources, unnamed sources, and ask them to stick their necks out, knowing those sources might later themselves be exposed. And after all, what you see in our paper is about 10% of what we collect each day. The 90% breaks down into a lot of conversations with hundreds of thousands of people all over the world who are telling our reporters things that we will not use, but are given to our reporters in confidence as background. And if the government, either through the courts or legislation, could negate that, then I would say that we would be relegated to simply reporting what the government says each day, which is really the end of a free press. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good point. Let me make a distinction. I think if we were to allow throughout the paper, both in news and in features, the language that really all of us are using today in contrast to 5 years ago, I think that would then cause a serious loss of circulation to the Times, and we could not, no publication can exist without circulation, as no television station can exist without viewers. Circulation is as important as advertising, of course, to our survival. However, we do use language when it is pertinent, we feel, to the understanding of a news story. When you have, for example, a student using certain four-letter words when he's taunting a cop, or when the cop uses certain language back to the student, or the cop initiates the confrontation, whichever way, when that use of the language causes a situation to develop, the cop loses his cool or the student loses his cool, and you have a confrontation, you have violence, that is where we should use the language, where it's absolutely pertinent to the understanding of the story. But just in casual writing, I don't feel we should use those words. Now, we have used some words where it's pertinent to the understanding of a news story. We've had tremendous reaction, negative reaction from our older readers, as you might expect. They are not used to seeing those words in their family newspaper. It's all right to see it in another publication, a magazine, a special magazine or something, but not in a newspaper that has such broad circulation of the Times. Now, I don't know what we're going to do about this problem, because sometimes we'll just use the number of spaces for the word itself, and that's kind of silly because everybody knows what the word is. Other times we use the first letter of the word and then the number of spaces. Yeah. Finish on your point.
Yeah, like, do you feel that it's your decision to omit it if you are quoting something? I mean, like, you're quoting it, you feel you can make that decision just to omit it, and because some readers might be repulsed by it. Like, when I read this transcripts of, like, the Sharon Tate trial, I would focus more on the murders than reading a four-letter
Mm-hmm.
word. In either case, I
Yeah.
think it's your decision to decide to omit it.
Well, we won't invent quotes or distort quotes or change quotes. If it's a quote, that's one thing. But where our reporter is witnessing an event, say on a police-student confrontation, well, if that isn't quoting a presidential commission or a report that is simply our decision as to whether we want to use that word or what words. That's very different than, say, taking the Kerner Commission and reporting or quoting an article or quoting a speech that's been made by somebody. We won't change that, obviously, because that would be distortion. But we do use selectivity in everything we publish. Yes? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That tends to be true now. There's been a change in journalism. A few years ago, not very many young people wanted to come into journalism. They wanted to go into public relations because it was more money. And in most instances, it does mean more money to start with. Whereas now, I think a great many young people look at journalism as another and unique opportunity, which is to do something about changing our society. I mean, how can an individual do something about, other than running for office, and maybe that's not a very good answer either, but if you work for a newspaper or magazine and you're given the freedom that we give our kind of people to write, it can make a difference, I think, to our problems. So we are now flooded with applications. It's just changed overnight, and there are a great many people want to work for our newspaper, and other newspapers are having the same experience. So I think Bill Thomas, who's our metropolitan editor, is correct, and now you can't take them right out of journalism schools. We prefer to have them work for a publication for a period of time before they come in, 2 or 3 years.
Two more questions.
Okay. Yes. No, they're at the bottom of the readership polls. They've just slipped, and we do a very careful and scientific continuing analysis of our readership. In-depth interviews in person, by mail, by phone, to know what they're reading and not reading. And those comic strips that used to be so famous and so well read are now at the bottom of the list, so we simply drop them. One more.
How did you go about ceasing the harassment of the LA Times household solicitors? There's somebody you could send your name into and say, I would appreciate receiving more calls from the LA Times.
Well, yes, I guess there is. I didn't realize that we were putting that much pressure on our telephone solicitors. But as far as I know, there's a lot of people stopping the paper every day for various reasons, and yeah, I see. Yeah. Well, sometimes they do work from telephone lists, and they're supposed to have, through our computers, present subscribers excluded from those telephone lists, but apparently you're in an area where they don't, either not following that practice or are not able to do so. So if you want to drop me a line personally, I'll pass it down to my circulation department and make sure you're not called. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.